scaling of each of the X and Y axes are not consistent from one graph to the other. So at the end, you could come up and say, well, that graph doesn't make any sense because tendon is more stiff here than ligament. And you would be right. It's just they're different graphs. So what I'll do now is, now that we have a little bit of an understanding of stress-strain curves, I'm going to go back to the beginning of the lecture and just start from there, because I think that'll help understanding just what the stress-strain curves are before we get. All right? So by the end of this particular lecture, I would hope that you'd be able to compare the difference between ligament and tendon. There are different things. If they were the same thing, they just call them the same thing, but they're not. So they have different functions, they have different reasons for doing what they do, and because of that, they're complemented by different materials that make them and different particular shapes of the material. Hopefully you'd be able to not draw the stress-strain curve, but maybe if I showed you a stress-strain curve between this piece of material and that piece of material, you'd be able to tell me which is stiffer, all right? And maybe tell me how a ligament and a tendon might break down, and that's pretty, like, typically. There's other ways for ligaments and tendons to break down. Like if I get pushed out of a moving car and I hit like a telephone pole, I could rupture everything, but that's an atypical mechanism for injury. So what I want to do today is just talk about, in very general terms, mechanisms for injuries that are either like acute or chronic that aren't like catastrophic to ligaments and tendons, all right? So the first thing that we got to do is just talk about what a ligament does. We talked about it a little bit. Ligaments attach bone to bone. And there are interesting differences between, say, for instance, bone and then ligament, tendon, and muscle. Ligament, tendon, and muscle are arranged with a hierarchical organization, and I'll explain what that means. All right? Bone has blood flow that goes almost like through it entirely. So if you injure bone, typically there's going to be pretty quick swelling, but because there's vascularization throughout the bone, the healing time for the bone will take typically less time than an injury to ligament, tendon, or muscle because of the vascularization. Sometimes when a bone heals, it's actually stronger in that area of break than it actually was before because of trabeculae lining up and all sorts of things. But one thing to remember is that the blood flow to ligament, tendon, and muscle is somewhat limited to particular areas of that tissue. So if the tissue gets injured, it's hard to get blood flow directly to the area of the tissue that's injured. That's why sometimes people say, man, you know, I sprained my ankle like 4 or 5 months ago, it still hurts. Yeah, it's going to hurt, especially because you can't lay off your ankle and keep it immobile. And it's injury to the ligament and tendon, which means that it's probably going to need rest and more vascularization than an injury to the bone. All right, so if you have an injury and the injury starts swelling up, you have an injury to the finger, you put ice on it for 5 minutes immediately, you take the ice off, not a huge amount of swelling. Okay? Typically, that means to me, it's probably more a ligament or a tendon problem. But if there's an injury to the finger, you put the ice on it, and then 5 minutes later you look and it's bruised and it's already appreciably swelling, probably going to indicate more of a bone problem there because bone is vascularized, more so than the other materials. So if it starts swelling right away, to me, I'm going to say, make sure when you go to the doctor, say maybe there's something wrong with a broken finger or something like that. I'm not trying to diagnose, I'm just trying to give a little bit of like some backstory. All right, so ligaments attach bone to bone, and the structure of which is this, right? They're like this hierarchical structure, meaning there's a big part, this is like the whole ligament looks like that, but then the ligament is broken down into sections of ligament. And then sections of ligaments, until finally you get all the way down to your collagen fibers and the smallest part of the ligament. The issue with this is that the blood vessels and the blood flow is limited to these protective sheaths. Right? What are the protective sheaths for? Well, sometimes you'll notice like these cables here that plug things into the projectors have those mesh like outer coverings. And what the mesh outer covering to these cables does is if I drop my computer, instead of the cable attached to the computer and the HDMI ripping out, the mesh covering takes the tension before the cable does, right? So the mesh covering of your muscles, ligaments, and tendons, your epitendon, your epiligament, your periligament, what they do is they provide blood flow, but they also protect the collagen, elastin fibers of the materials from unnecessary and potentially injuring tensions that material is going to go through, right? All right, so Ligaments attach bone to bone. And because of that, they have to withstand forces from many directions. So somebody could grab my foot and pull on my foot, and that means my ACL and all the ligaments in my knee would go through tension. But I could also wiggle my foot like that, and now they go through torsion. Or I could get kicked in the side of the knee, and now they're experiencing a bending or a shear force. So there's many different forces that are potentially able to, I guess, innervate in terms of like distributing force through a ligament. Because of that, the structure of the ligament has to be able to withstand forces from multiple directions. So if you look under a microscope at a ligament, and you look at the collagen and elastin and the proteoglycan thing, the filaments that actually make up the ligament, you'll notice like almost like a cross-hatched structure of a ligament. So if there's force from this direction, this particular filament can provide tension, so that can protect the ligament from this direction, but this ligament can protect it from that direction, and protect it from that. Sorry, this filament can protect it from this direction and that direction. So you have, it's like a tensegrity structure. It's almost kind of like a spider web, all right, where the material can withstand forces from multiple directions. Granted, it makes it weaker in any one direction than if, say, for instance, all the material was lined up in one parallel structure. It would be very strong at withstanding force from that direction, but all other directions would be compromised. So because your ligaments need to withstand forces from multiple directions, the structure of the material also complements that need. All right? So one of the things that happens, though, when the ligament starts to break down, how will a ligament break down? Well, if there's enough force to start to break down those particular filaments, then tearing of those ligaments is going to, those filaments is going to occur. All right? So I'm sure you guys have either watched on football in the NFL, right? Sometimes the announcers would be like totally amazed that there was a non-contact injury. Sometimes you'll see that they like even celebrate from like making a sack, and then they'll jump up and down, they'll like go like this and clap, and they tear their ACL. And then all of a sudden, for the next 2 or 3 days, you'll hear on sports talk radio, can you believe that so-and-so tore his ACL on a non-contact injury? That's what they said about Wes Welker. He was just running across the field, tore his ACL, and they were mystified. How could that happen? To me, I just want to talk about like tissue dynamics with that, all right? Does somebody want to help me for a second? My man. All right, so when you injure a ligament, when you injure your ACL, what do they call it? They usually say that you will what to your ACL? You tore your ACL. But if you injure your bicep, say for instance doing a Romanian deadlift, right? What will they say that you did to your bicep tendon? You ruptured. So there's a difference in those two particular terms in exactly what's happening. So what I want you to do is I want you to very, very slowly just try to tear the piece of paper. But as you do it, I want you to listen to what's happening. Okay? Tear the piece of paper as slow as you can. So you can hear it. Stop. So you can hear it. You can hear each fiber breaking. Right? And not only that, but it's a time-sensitive process that starts at a particular time, and sometime later more of the material is torn. Tearing something takes time. It's a fiber-by-fiber process. Okay? Now, once the material is torn, it is not ruptured. This material is not ruptured. It's definitely compromised, it's definitely torn, but it's not ruptured. Okay? Now, other things happen when the material starts to tear. First of all, it's much weaker. Right? And second of all, the material actually becomes longer. So the more the material tears, the longer the ligament is going to get. And if the ligament is longer and less strong, it's going to increase joint mobility, increase forces that are going through the joint, which is going to make the problem worse until now I have a non-contact injury. So I would say that the ligament is tearing over time, and by the time the ligament or the ACL tears, I would argue that a good amount of the injury had already occurred. All right? And one of our guys tore his ACL doing a 2.5 on floor last year, but it didn't look like he landed poorly. But every time we talk about landing in the gym, you'll see he lands like this, lands like this, lands like this, slowly but surely adding shear and bending forces to the ACL. and he tore his ACL, and he was like, "How can you believe it? Can you believe it?" And to me, I was like, "Yeah, I think that what we tried to do is we tried to make corrective action doing all sorts of PT and stuff, but by the time he tore his ACL, it had already been damaged, okay? So, and then a lot of times you'll notice that a lot of the ACL tears happen either right at the end of the off-season training or right at the beginning of the season. And during the off-season training, they're going to be doing ladders and running up and down and all this stuff. And if there's enough force to start to break down the particular filaments in the tissue, and there's not enough time to vascularize because the blood flow is limited, there's not enough time to vascularize and then get the material back into the elastic region, then more tears happen, the material becomes even more compromised until there's an issue, okay? But rupturing is different. So what I want you to do is rupture that piece of paper. This is hard. This might be a you can do it. Right, so that's a rupture. Right? The whole material compromises all at once instantaneously because of a huge force that's put on it. And a rupture is going to happen when the tensile force of the material is not as strong as the force that I'm putting through the material. That's what a rupture is. So hopefully now we can talk a little bit more, love you, hopefully we can talk a little bit more about maybe how a rupture or a tear could potentially happen, all right? The tear is a little bit easier to talk about. If you have a material that is loaded with enough force to start to break the material down, eventually the material will break down, just like the piece of paper did. And if there's not enough time to allow for nutrients and healing into that particular material, it's just going to keep breaking down until it enters its potential rupture point of the stress strain curve, and then you have a complete tear of the material. Okay? When will that happen? It's totally dependent upon the material, the person, the hydration status, the actual motion, that's the forces that are being put through the material. Yes, sir. 1 second, please.
With the tearing of like the ACL, so it seems like it's sudden, right? But you're saying that it's a process throughout time. Where's the pain, like to the body, letting you know that there's pain there? It may break or tear, or whatever.
I mean, in regards to nerve endings and ligaments, it's much more, much less dense than nerve endings and bone. So typically, if somebody tears their ACL, they're not in a huge amount of pain. They may be in a little bit of pain due to swelling and things like that. I also don't know enough about the nerve endings and ligaments and tendons to make sure that I give you, oh, this is the nerve, this is the neural, synapses that are occurring. Okay, but the nerve endings and ligaments are much less dense than nerve endings and bones, so you'll typically have less pain. All right?
So you don't feel the process of it tearing throughout time.
There are some times where I'll do like a left leg split and I can feel like the ligaments in my knee are like, please don't do this anymore. But typically like the micro tears that, so like when you're doing strength and you're doing eccentric contractions and you're doing micro damage to your muscles, right? I mean, you feel that in terms of soreness, but it's not an injury kind of pain, it's a soreness kind of pain, so you kind of sometimes work through it. Right? I'm sometimes when I wake up, I'm like, oh man, my neck is sore, right? And those are pains that are potentially indicating slight tissue breakdown, but I'm never loading my neck up so much that it breaks down, over time, so I don't really notice a problem, right? So it depends on how catastrophic the injury is, right? And it seems like you know stuff, so am I right or wrong? Am I good? You keep looking at me, and we're on pace with you. So if anybody knows something more than I know, I'm not the smartest person in the world, right? I had a good sleep last night, right? And I teach classes. Aside from that, there's probably people who know more than I know, right? So if you have something that you want to add, obviously feel free to do so. But probably nerve endings are much less dense in terms of the numbers. Yeah, 1 second.
I was going to ask about healing. So if you have a ligament that you're breaking down over time, how much time does it take to heal, and will it heal back to its original?
I mean, it depends on probably the ligament. Depends on how much force
like
you
an
put on the ligament. I mean, typical ACL recovery is going to be like a month. Like 12 months, 9 to 12 months. But that's after.
But I'm saying like before you tear.
I don't know how to answer that.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. I'm sure it's going to be independent on the activity being done, the age, and the integrity of the joint in the first place. Some of our guys, typically gymnasts, already have laxity in their joints. That's because their ligaments are either less stiff or longer than other individuals anyway. So it could be the case that there's a difference between individuals, so it would be hard to really answer that. To me, what I try to do is like not do plyometrics every day of the week, right? Make sure that I have a good long periodization plan to make sure that I'm spacing out my plyometrics with my squats and all that stuff to make sure that I do allow time for vascularization and healing. And if they do say something like, ooh, my knee hurts or my ligament hurts here, then I try to give them, a week or two of rest until they're able to tell me that they don't feel pain anymore, and then give them a little bit more rest on top of that. So to me, it's just really, I don't know, I don't have the MRI capability, so I just try to do it, just listening and observing.
You just bring up a really good point, I think, with it not necessarily being a direct impact injury. Super extreme, but it happened to my brother 2 weeks ago. He does jiu-jitsu, and he's pretty intense, with his jiu-jitsu career. He's also a pipe fitter, and he was just simply climbing up through a really narrow hole, and tore his groin, all these different muscles, and it turned into this crazy infection. He was in the hospital for 2 weeks, and it's it can get really out of control. I mean, if you're not listening to your body, he definitely had parts of his body speaking to him all along, but it took that simple, funny step for just a simple movement just to really grind it and tear.
So I mean, it could have been a tendon thing that he injured, I don't know, but so to me,
right.
When the athletes come in, they're like, yeah, my leg hurts. I'm like, okay, first question, how long has it been hurting?
Right.
Well, I did something to it on floor last week that hurt. Or, I don't know, man, it's been hurting for 8 months, and it's in here, and I can't really pinpoint where it is. To me, the 8-month thing, that long time, chronic injury, kind of like the tearing is an iterative process. If there's a long time component to it, I'm immediately thinking that it's a ligament problem, or some type of ligament problem. It could be the case that he had a tendon injury based on the stuff that we'll talk about in a couple minutes with tendon. So I don't know necessarily what happened, but the time thing. Or if I say, yeah, my knee hurts, he says, my knee hurts. I said, well, when did you hurt it? Do you remember? Oh yeah, last week I did a double full on floor, and I kind of felt like a little bit of a tweak. Well then, to me, that means it's an all-at-once injury. Maybe, to me, I'm starting to think that it's either a tendon strain or a muscle strain or something like that.
Right.
So it just depends on the information that I get.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So, I mean, his was definitely long. Right?
Do you know if he tore a ligament or a tendon? And if he tore a tendon, maybe I'll give you a little bit of information about how he could possibly have done that too.
Honestly, he got so many tests done, and the priority was his infection because he was totally out of commission and not in a good place. So as he couldn't even walk, it was so bad. And they had the MRI done. He got a lot of information on it. He didn't go deep into sharing with it just because he was literally on an IV for 2 weeks.
So let's talk about the tendons, because the ligament injury, the mechanism for injury to the ligament is pretty much that. Enough force to start breaking down the tissue without enough time to keep that tissue vascularized and healed and maintain its elastic region, right? So if you can maintain, if you can reduce forces on the ligament, give enough time to heal, unless it's a catastrophic injury, I mean, that's the particular mechanism for injury. A long time iterative process, fiber by fiber, all right? But the good thing is if you allow for healing, then the tissue potentially could return to a more functional state. Okay? Any other questions? Yeah? Yeah, of course. No,
so earlier you said bone may become stronger after healing.
Yeah.
Is that true with tendons and ligaments, or is it less so?
Well, bone has stuff in it called trabeculae, and what trabeculae does is it's there are these bone cells that actually will realign themselves to better dissipate forces that go through the bone. So the bone structure is almost like a dynamic structure in itself. So, and because of that, the calcification, and especially if you make sure that you're doing exercise and the bone has an opportunity to increase in density. In terms of ligament, I would also say it depends on how the degree of strain, the degree of injury to the ligament, to the tendon, and how much rest you give. So I still would say it's probably dependent upon the history of the issue. All right, so let's talk a little bit about tendons. Tendons are a little bit more complicated to talk about because tendons are attached to muscle. So if you don't know how muscle works, it's kind of hard to understand how this is going to relate to tendons. They call it the muscle tendinous unit, all right, for a reason, because they work kind of together. What a tendon does is it stores elastic energy, all right? That's what tendons do. The muscle is going to contract, or if the muscle stays really tight and the muscle doesn't want to change its length, the thing attached to the muscle is going to change its length, which is tendons. All right? Tendons store elastic energy, and you can use elastic energy for motion. And the cool thing about it is it doesn't take calories or batteries or anything like that. It just takes the ability to change the angle of a joint and stretch the tendon, as long as you can keep the muscle attached to the tendon relatively stiff. Okay? So muscle and tendon structure are, again, this hierarchical structure that somewhat limits blood flow. And you may have heard of this sliding filament theory, or actin and myosin, or how muscles work. There are these two filaments inside your muscles called actin and myosin, and apparently what they do is they attach to each other, and when they attach to each other, they kind of like crimp around each other, and that's what makes a contraction. All right? But if the actin and myosin are too far away from each other to link up, then your muscle can't make a contraction. Or if the actin and myosin are so close that they actually pass each other, they also can't make a contraction. So in order for your muscle to make a contraction, actin and myosin have to interact with each other. All right? This is the length-tension relationship of muscle. If the length of the muscle is too long or too short, the ability to contract that muscle will also reduce. That's why if somebody throws a big bag of rice at you, you're going to catch it with your arms at 90 degrees. Boom, like that. Because it puts your bicep at the best biomechanical position to take advantage of as many actin and myosin cross bridges as possible. When my arm is totally extended and my bicep is as long as it can get, you even try this. Try that right now. And straighten your arm as long as you can, and then try to tighten up your bicep. No, don't flex, because now you're changing the length. Keep your arm totally straight, and now try to tighten your bicep, and it's hard to do because the actin and myosin cross bridges have been pulled so far apart that they can't link up anymore. So your muscle can't make an active contraction. All right? If you take your muscle and you contract it all the way, you also have, it's an overlap, too much overlap of those filaments, and your muscle also can't make a great contraction. All right? So, we're going to talk about what's called this length-tension relationship. All right? Now, these little things at the top, these little things at the top here represent myosin and actin. Now here, the myosin and actin are too close, and here they're too far spread apart. So when the actin and myosin are too close, you can't make great contractions. But when the actin and myosin are right in the middle of the muscle length, right in the middle, you can see there's a much better opportunity to create muscle force. And then eventually the muscle force drops down because the actin and myosin can't interact with each other any longer. Well, now we have a little bit of a problem, because it says over here, when my muscle length is very long, I cannot make an active contraction. So when my muscle length is like this, and my bicep is as long as possible, and I can't create any muscle tension, if somebody were to hand me just like a cup of coffee, why wouldn't my bicep rupture? If I can't make any tension with the muscle and the actual ability for actin and myosin to link together, why doesn't my bicep rupture when it's totally extended? Because what?
The tension of the tendon holds your arm out without letting it go through.
I mean, so what you're saying is that there's a particular amount of tension inherent in the actual tissue itself. Okay? Like, this is not a live piece of material, and it has no actin and myosin, but it can withstand tension. So if I took your bicep and your tendon out of your body, and I stapled it to the wall, I'd be able to pull on the material. Right? That's called passive tension. The material has a passive component because it's just material. This is passive tension, right? Dead material that can still produce a tensile force. So the very nature of the tissues itself has a passive component. The active ability to create tension refers to the ability of the actin and myosin to interact and make a contraction. When my muscle is elongated all of the way, I cannot make an active contraction. So my bicep doesn't rupture because it has this passive length-tension relationship. And you'll notice when the muscle length gets really long and starts to drop down its active tension, the passive component, or the passive tension, starts to ramp up and give tensile force to the muscle, but this time not because of the actin and myosin, this time because of the tensile component of the actual muscle and tendon itself. So at this stage of the game, you're just pulling on that material. And if there's a force on that material that is big enough to withstand this particular threshold limit, then all of a sudden you're going to have a catastrophic rupture all at once of that particular material. Your muscles are not strong enough on their own to contract wicked tight and exceed that passive tension. So you can't rupture your own muscles on your own. Usually a tendon injury is going to happen because there's a very large external force. And that is coupled, happening at the same time as an active contraction of the muscle. So if muscle contracts really tight, muscle becomes more stiff. And if something's more stiff, it's less likely to change shape. So if I contract my muscle really tight, and now I'm about to do a deadlift with an isometrically stiff contracted bicep, and now I lift, if my arm is extended all the way and isometrically contracted as much as it can be, the only thing that's going to change its shape when I lift up that weight is now whatever's attached to that stiffened, contracted muscle, which is the passive component of the muscle and the muscle tendinous unit. So now, if the weight that I'm lifting exceeds this particular passive threshold of the tendon, now all of a sudden you're going to have a tendon tear. So where are examples that might happen? Well, a ligament injury might come if, say, for instance, you're doing plyometrics, hand vault, and tunneling every day of the week, and you're not giving enough rest, all right, with enough forces to break down the material. A tendon injury is going to happen when I have a very high passive force, or a force that's coming from the outside, coupled with an active contraction of the muscle. All right, so an example of that would be like running on vault. When you run on vault, especially if you're starting to utilize good running technique, as opposed to lifting your front knee and pointing this foot, you're supposed to keep that foot nice and flexed, nice and tight here. The reason why you're going to keep it flexed is because it'll engage your anterior tib and your gastrosoleus unit. And when that is isometrically contracted, it tightens up the muscles here, making them stiffer and less likely to change shape when they're loaded. The thing attached to the muscle, the Achilles tendon, is going to now be able to store energy and then release that energy, as long as I have good plyometrics and good neuromuscular, synapsing and stuff. And then you'll be able to get more energy out of the gastrosoleus unit, your Achilles tendon. So I have a tightened, isometrically contracted gastrosoleus unit, and now I'm slamming that into the ground on my forefoot, which is going to force dorsiflexion every step. So the high ground reaction force, or the ground force that's coming up as a result of me pushing down on the ground, that's a very high external to the body force. And that force is happening at the same time that you have a very high active contraction of the gastrosoleus unit. So you have a very high external passive force coupled with a very high active contraction of the muscle, making it so that the muscle is less likely to change its shape, and whatever attached to the muscle will. So if I'm pounding on the ground and I'm 130 pounds overweight and I'm trying to do running technique, or I'm doing a round-up back handspring, and at the end of my back handspring I have huge G's and forces coming into the ground, it wouldn't be a surprise to me, like Nicholas Merriman, who's got very weak gastrosoleus muscles, that the entire brunt of all of that force is coming down onto his Achilles tendon, and now there's a mechanism for injury. Right? So a tendon is going to injure when there's a high external force. Now you said that your brother, I believe?
My brother, yeah.
Your brother hurt his adductor muscle.
It sounds like it was his adductor. He didn't give me the full like.
It sounds like it's a tendon injury to me, not a ligament injury, because he did it at a particular time. And the high external force would be his body weight.
Yeah.
Is he like trim like Chris over there, or is he?
He's he's like he's a cut dude. I mean, he's
How much is he weigh?
Probably like 205.
I mean, so he's got a good external weight, and as he's going either up the ladder or whatever, he's probably bracing his internal rotators and external rotators so that he can brace himself on the ladder, which is going to be an internal active force coupled with that body weight, probably resulting in a tendon strain or a muscle tear or something like that.
Right.
I have no idea.
Right.
But that would be like something that I would be like, maybe it's this or maybe it's that. So to me, that's what I was thinking. Either it's a ligament problem, and because he does this active occupation, maybe he's up and down stairs, up and down stairs, up and down stairs all day, up and down ladders, lifting and putting down, and moving and transitioning weight. And if that's the case, over time, ligament breakdown could have occurred. So it could have been a ligament issue.
I thought it was too, because like also too in jiu-jitsu, like you're constantly like
Guarding,
constantly
torsion.
with your adductors. Yeah. So I think it wasn't. I think we wanted it.
And I mean, if he's doing jiu-jitsu every day with constant torsion and tension on his joints and stuff like that, so that's one of the hints that, like you said in the beginning, I was like, that's interesting. Maybe it's a ligament thing, but then you said it happened at one particular time on a ladder, and it would be reasonable.
And it gradually grew though, like throughout the day. So like he didn't really know. He thought it was when he was kind of like coming out of his hole, and then gradually it just started kind of getting sore, and then by the next day he couldn't.
I mean, mostly that's probably due to just white blood cells and neutrophils and all that stuff getting to that area and trying to deal with the swelling and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, it's just interesting now how it all connects. But.
Let's see what else we got here. So if you look at the structure of tendon compared to ligament, I even have another graph to show you the difference between the two. So ligament is much more cross-hatched here, and then I used to have a screenshot of it, and this is what tendon looks like here. So you see, it's much more like, it's almost like an elastic band, where all the material is kind of in one direction. The reason why all of the material in muscle is in one direction, as opposed to multiple directions, is because for the most part, your tendons are attached to muscles, and your muscle doesn't contract in multiple different directions. My bicep contraction is in one plane, right? Forward, backward, one plane of movement. So because of that, the tendons that attach to my bicep tendon also have the benefit of being able to align in that one direction, which means the tendon is very strong at withstanding forces in that one direction, and it's not really going to get an appreciable amount of forces in another direction. So tendons are very, very strong. All of the fibers are parallel to one another to make sure that the integrity of that particular tendon is maintained throughout any contraction of that muscle, which means that the tendon is very strong in that particular direction, but in other directions it might potentially be compromised. Now, how is this potentially going to lead to pain and injuries that we've all seen? I mean, everybody in my gym is, or not everybody, I've heard of it, but I'll go. Everybody in my gym has flat feet, everybody, right? Flat feet is a result of training and strength and this and that, but also the surfaces that we land on, especially 8 inches and tumble track and trampoline, they all force this hyperpronation as you land. And when that happens, what you can see is like malformation of particular body segments. In this case, you'll see that he's got a pretty significant bowing of the Achilles tendon. And what happens is that Achilles tendon goes through 2 different forces. First of all, the Achilles tendon, you can see bends, right? There's a bending here. But what happens when you bend something is it's a combination of 2 different external forces. When I bend something, this side of the material is going to go through tension, while this side of the material is going to go through compression. So something very different is happening to the material on either side of that particular joint. All right? And because of that, there's going to be a difference in the ability to dissipate force at that joint. So oftentimes you'll see this right over here is going to result in a lot of pain at the heel, or Seaver's disease. If you push on the back of their heel, you'll see it's an incredible amount of pain, right? So what we want to do is just make sure that we have good muscle structure to maintain joint stability, so that you don't put extra forces and tendons and ligaments that I mentioned. You're going to push the ligaments and tendons into their plastic region, stress strain curves, and eventually get injured. All right, does anybody have any questions about any of that? Now, there's many different mechanisms for injuries. Like you grips could lock up, and then you break your arm, and then your ulna severs a ligament. Like those are different mechanisms for injury. But to me, I just try to use this as a little bit of almost a hypothesis. My athlete comes in and they say, yes, my leg hurts, and I say, how long has it been hurting? Can you remember something specifically that you heard it doing? And then I can start from there, and if their parents have questions about what they should do with the PTA stuff, at least I can say, well, this is a hypothesis. Go to your primary care physician with this information and see what you know from there. Any questions or anything? Cool. All right. Love you guys. I appreciate the opportunity here.